Grant was in Savannah, having breakfast at his Cherry Mansion headquarters, when he heard the distant sounds of artillery fire. He was on crutches as he recovered from a fall from his horse, and he was waiting for more of Buell's army to arrive in Savannah. Grant ordered Bull Nelson to march his division along the east side of the river to a point opposite Pittsburgh Landing, where it could be ferried over the battlefield. Grant then took his steamboat Tigress south to Crump's Landing, where he told Lew Wallace to get his division ready to move. Grant proceeded to Pittsburgh Landing, arriving at 9 a.m. The landing was beginning to accumulate men who had fled their posts, and Grant ordered the colonel to halt all stragglers. He then rode inland and confirmed that the Confederates had launched a full-scale attack instead of a probing action. He sent a message to Crump's Landing, ordering Lew Wallace to bring his division to the battlefield. After the beginning of the battle, Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace sent his 2nd Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General John MacArthur, to fill a gap in the Union left between Hulbert's position at the Peach Orchard and Stuart's brigade at the extreme Union left. MacArthur had only 2 of his regiments, since the others had been sent to assist Sherman and guard the Snake River Bridge that led to Crump's Landing. His 2-regiment force was bolstered by Battery A from the 1st Illinois Light Artillery, and Wallace's 1st and 3rd Brigades, commanded by Colonel James M. Tuttle and Colonel Thomas W. Sweeney, respectively moved into positions near Duncan Field and what is now called the Sunken Road, between the divisions of McClellan and Hurlbut. From 9:30 a.m. to 10:30, most of the fighting at this position was the exchange of artillery fire. On the extreme Union left, Stuart's brigade had heard musket firing early in the morning, but did not believe they were under attack until they heard distant artillery fire. At 9:30 a.m., Johnston received reports that Union soldiers were deploying on the Confederate right flank. To remedy this potential problem, he sent 2 brigades from Bragg's corps and called up Breckinridge's reserve corps. What his scouts had actually found was the camp belonging to Stuart's brigade. Stuart was near the Hamburg-Savannah Road, close to Lick Creek. Around 9:40 a.m., Stuart began receiving artillery fire, and 20 minutes later his men were attacked by Confederate infantry. Shortly after 10 a.m., the remnants of Sherman's division established a new position further north from Shiloh Church. This position was near a crossroads of the Hamburg-Purdy Road with the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road. By this time, Sherman's 3rd Brigade was eliminated. At its last intact regiment ran away, Colonel Jesse Hildebrand, the brigade commander, remained on the field as the volunteer aide for McClellan's headquarters. Sherman's 1st Brigade, commanded by Colonel John A. McDowell, was west of the Hamburg-Purdy Road and cut off. Colonel Ralph P. Buckland's 4th Brigade were fragmented and ammunition was low. Sherman prepared to defense with the men he had left, including Colonel Julius Race's 3rd Brigade from McClellan's division that had reinforced Sherman's left earlier. Sherman also had the 6th Indiana Artillery Battery, commanded by Captain Frederick Bear, and part of the battery from McClellan. For the first time, the Union Army had a continuous front. From west to east were the remnants of Sherman's division, McClellan, W.H.L. Wallace, the remnants of Prentice's division, Hurlbut, MacArthur's brigade from W.H.L. Wallace's division, and Stuart's brigade from Sherman's division. Hurlbut was near a peach orchard, Prentice was near the Sunken Road, and W.H.L. Wallace was adjacent to Duncan Field at the Sunken Road. After a failed attack and the addition of more men, the Confederates attacked Sherman and McClellan again at 11 a.m. This Confederate attacking force consisted of portions of 7 brigades. The Union losses in this attack included Colonel Wraith, who was mortally wounded, and Bear's battery, which fled to the rear after Bear was shot dead. On the Confederate side, Wood's brigade took heavy losses, but routed the brigade of Colonel C. Carroll Marshall from McClellan's division. Wood's men then defeated Veitch's brigade, but Wood was thrown from his horse and temporarily out of action. At this time, his brigade became scattered and disorganized. By 11:20 a.m., the Confederate Army controlled the Hamburg-Purdy Road. Benefiting from the exhaustion and disorganization of the Confederate force, Sherman and McClellan fell back about 200 yards north of the crossroads. Sherman's separated 1st Brigade linked with McClellan around 11:30 a.m. The sunken road was on an old wagon track, called an abandoned road, in the only time it was mentioned in the official records. From west to east, it ran from Duncan Field to a peach orchard, eventually known as the Peach Orchard, at the Hamburg-Savannah Road. The old wagon track was so worn and washed out that it had an embankment that ranged from a few inches to supposedly 3 foot. This ready-made entrenchment received the name Sunken Road in post-war years. Some historians doubt that the road was actually sunken. Nothing in the official records mentions it as sunken, and the soldier who wrote it in his diary that the road was 3 feet deep was in a regiment that was not close enough to the road to see it. When the fighting later became heated in this area, Duncan Field and the sunken road and the woods on the north side of the road, the Confederates began calling it the Hornet's Nest. At the beginning of the day, Prentiss had 7,545 men present for duty. By the time he moved back to Barnes Field, near the Hamburg-Purdy Road, after casualties and men that ran away, he had only 600 men and portions of 2 batteries. He deployed his men near the divisions of W.H.L. Wallace and Hurlbut along the sunken road. Grant reinforced Prentiss with 600 men from the 23rd Missouri Infantry Regiment, which had disembarked from Pittsburgh Landing a few hours earlier. Grant visited the 1,200-man force and told Prentiss to hold all hazards. The Union troops along the sunken road were protected by hickory and oak trees. Some Union troops at this location had modern, for 1862, weapons and fences for shelter, while some of the Confederate attacks were across open ground. These factors combined to make the frontal assaults difficult for the Confederate attackers. One attack was led by Confederate Division Commander Benjamin F. Cheatham, and his 2nd Brigade was thoroughly repulsed. Southeast of the sunken road, Stuart still had the Union left. The Confederate brigades, commanded by Brigadier Generals James R. Chambers and John K. Jackson, attacked Stuart's 3 regiments. The intensity of the fight increased around 11:15, causing most of the 71st Ohio Infantry to flee to the rear. Stuart repositioned his remaining 2 regiments, but eventually began panicking. Although Stuart restored order, he was wounded and command temporarily fell to Lieutenant Colonel Oscar Marlborough. Lew Wallace's division had made little progress following Grant's order to move to the battlefield. Early in the morning, his division had been spread as much as 5 miles from Crump's Landing. The purpose of his positioning was to protect routes that would be used for reinforcements in case his isolated division was attacked. An additional messenger from Grant found him at 11:30 a.m., and Wallace did not get his division moving until noon. Another messenger found Wallace at 2 p.m. and notified Wallace that he was on the wrong road. Wallace believed he was to reinforce Sherman and McClellan at their original camps. He was unaware that those divisions had been pushed back towards Pittsburgh Landing. By noon, Sherman and McClellan had pushed back to Jones Field. However, the 3 regiments from McDowell's 1st Brigade had reunited with Sherman and McClelland, and 3 additional regiments arrived for reinforcement. McClelland's troops began a counterattack with the assistance of McDowell's brigade. The Confederates were pushed back beyond McClelland's morning headquarters, and both sides had numerous casualties. With reinforcements, the Confederate forces began a bayonet charge at about 1 p.m. that pushed McClelland and McDowell back to their original counterattack line at Jones's Field. On the Union right, the divisions of Sherman and McClelland, plus Veach's brigade, were a disorganized group of individual soldiers and portions of other regiments. Many soldiers had dropped their equipment and headed to Pittsburgh Landing. Still, Sherman and McClelland fought on with their remnants of their divisions. The situation at the Union Center was much better. Prentiss repelled multiple attacks by the brigade commanded by Colonel Randall L. Gibson. Captain Andrew Hickenlooper's 5th Ohio Independent Light Artillery Battery used shrapnel and canister to stop the first charge, and Confederate losses were considerable. After a 3rd try, Gibson's brigade suffered enough casualties, including 1 colonel hit in the face, that most of the men fell back, and the brigade was not engaged for the rest of the day. Among the Union soldiers killed was Major James Powell, who led the early morning patrol that discovered the Confederate army at Fraley Field. While Prentiss was defending against Gibson, Sweeney repelled Confederate attacks near Duncan Field. The Union left, even more so than the right, was pushed back. Stuart's remaining Union regiments, temporarily commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Malmberg, in the absence of Colonel T. Kilby Smith, was several stands east of Belfield against 2 of Bragg's brigades. Fortunately for the Union Army, Bragg's hungry men exhausted their ammunition and pillaged food from the Union camps instead of continuing the attack. Around 2:15, Smith ordered Stuart's brigade to withdraw, and by 2:30, Stuart's brigade was done fighting for the day. While Stuart was fighting, the adjacent position of the Union line was occupied by MacArthur's partial army. MacArthur's force was attacked around 2 o'clock by one of Breckinridge's brigades. Despite reinforcements, MacArthur fell back about 300 yards north of the Peach Orchard, where he stabilized his line 20 minutes later. On MacArthur's right, Hurlburt's division, also under attack, causing it to fall back. Most of the attackers were from Breckinridge's 3rd Brigade, commanded by Colonel Walter S. Statham. As the Union troops fell back, they would pause to shoot at the oncoming Confederates. Artillery was also used to slow the attackers. General Albert Sidney Johnston rode as much as 40 paces in front of Breckinridge's line. His uniform was torn from bullets in several places, and the heel of one of his boots was gone. After sending an order to Colonel Statham, an object could be heard striking Johnston. Although blood could be seen dripping from his leg, the general did not show concern. Shortly afterwards, he was slumping in his saddle. After asked if he was wounded, Johnston replied, "Yes, and I fear seriously." Johnston bled to death from a torn popliteal artery in his right leg. Although a tourniquet might have saved Johnston's life, his personal physician had sent elsewhere to treat the wounded. Johnston died about 100 yards south of the Bell Farm at 2:30. He was the highest-ranking soldier killed in combat in the American Civil War. With the death of Johnston, Beauregard officially became the Confederate Army's commander. Some historians argue that since Beauregard was directing the army from the rear, while Johnston was at the front, Beauregard already had the role of army commander. The Confederate attack on its right, or Union left, stalled after Johnston's death, and many exhausted Confederate soldiers drank what they had become known as the Bloody Pond, located between the Peach Orchard and Wicker Field. The lull was caused more by the exhaustion and disorganized condition of the Confederate Army than the mourning for Johnston or Beauregard's lack of action. Beauregard sent Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles to coordinate an attack on the Hornet's Nest. At 2:50 p.m., Lieutenant William Gwynn, commander of the USS Tyler, put his gunboat into action by firing on the 2 Confederate batteries near the Union left. After an hour, Gwynn was joined by the USS Lexington, and the 2 gunboats positioned themselves about 3/4 of a mile south of the Pittsburgh landing. At first, the shelling had more of a psychological impact than a destructive one. On the ground at the Union left, MacArthur's partial brigade fought the Confederate brigades commanded by Brigadier Generals John K. Jackson and John S. Bowen. With Stuart now gone, MacArthur was also getting outflanked by Chalmers' brigade. Between 3 and 4, MacArthur moved all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing. Hurlbut's line was also fallen back, and only 1 regiment remained by 4:30, when Hurlbut ordered it to the rear. Sometime in the late afternoon, Grant assigned Colonel Joseph Darner Webster, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, the task of setting up a defensive position at Pittsburgh Landing. Webster used stragglers and non-combatant personnel. He began rounding up artillery pieces, including siege guns and any batteries or partial batteries that retreated back to the landing. He eventually assembled about 50 artillery pieces, and they were positioned on a ridge on the east side of the battlefield. At the Union right, Grant visited Sherman around 3 o'clock and found a difficult situation. The remaining regiments had few men, ammunition was low, and more men were either leaving or serving with other units. Some regiments had so many losses that they were ordered to Pittsburgh Landing, where they could reform. The Union line at this time was back to Jones Field and the surrounding area. The Confederate Army facing Sherman and McClellan were reorganizing, and some of the units were shifted to the Hornet's Nest. After another attack at 4 o'clock, Sherman and McClellan fell back around 5 o'clock. On the Union left, Bragg tried to pursue the retreating Union soldiers, but was harassed by Union gunboats firing with increasing accuracy. The Tennessee River, near high tide, and the Union gunboat leaders had discovered that by elevating their guns and using lower charges, they could hit targets close to the river. The Tyler had some direct hits on Chalmers' brigade, beginning at 5:35. The Confederate Army spent a considerable amount of time and resources assaulting the Hornet's Nest instead of bypassing it. Historians' estimates of the number of separate infantry charges, including those from earlier in the morning, range from 8 to 14. An estimated 10,000 Confederate soldiers were involved. At 3:30, the Confederate Army began moving all available artillery pieces into positions around the Hornet's Nest. Soon they had, at the time, the largest concentration of field artillery ever on the North American continent. This concentration, known as Ruggles Battery, was led by Brigadier General Ruggles. In his report, Ruggles claimed responsibility for the assembling of the batteries, but multiple people may have been involved, including Major Francis A. Shoup, Hardee's artillery chief, and Brigadier General James Trudeau. By 4 p.m., the Confederate artillery was firing on Wallace and Prentiss in the Hornet's Nest. Confederate artillery was concentrated near Duncan Field and to the south of the Eastern Corinth Road. It was not until 4:30 p.m. that all Confederate artillery batteries were engaged, and at least one historian believes that their effectiveness has been exaggerated. Shortly after 4 p.m., Hurlbut was gone from the east side of the Hornet's Nest, and McClellan had fallen back about half a mile from the west side. Realizing that they were going to be surrounded, Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace began leading his division north around 4:15. He was mortally wounded as a portion of his division escaped encirclement. A ravine north of the sunken road near Cloud Field became known as Hell's Hollow, and over 1,000 Union soldiers were captured there. By 4:45, most of Wallace's division were removed from the battlefield, and Prentiss was left with about 2,000 men. Around 5:30, various Union regiments began surrendering, including Prentiss, and approximately 2,200 Union soldiers were captured. In his memoirs, Grant was critical of Prentiss for not making a timely withdrawal. However, the Hornet's Nest stand by Prentiss and W.H.L. Wallace allowed Grant more time to prepare his last line. By the time the Hornet's Nest fell, Grant's men had a defensive line from Pittsburgh Landing to the Hamburg-Savannah Road and further north. Sherman commanded the right of the line, and McClellan took the centre. On the left were remnants of W.H.L. Wallace's division, plus Hulbert's division. At the landing were 10,000 to 15,000 stragglers and non-combatants. The line included the artillery assembled by Colonel Webster, and the 2 gunboats were close by. Grant and Webster rode up and down the line, urging the men to keep firing at their enemy.